Hello and welcome back. I hope you've all had a good holiday period. I'm of course now going to ruin all of those happy feelings because today we're talking about fascism. Now, I could do the same as every other YouTuber and talk about what fascism is and what it isn't, but that's both boring and useless. You don't need to hear from me what you could hear from a million other people, or just read Umberto Eco's fabulous work about the Fascist. Just before we start, I'd like to give a shout out to a podcast that is made by a friend of mine. It's called Hidden Wings and Bloodlust. It's a really informative podcast about the various species of ladybirds and what their lives are like, and interesting pieces of trivia about them. The most recent one was about the Adonis ladybird, and I learned some really interesting things. The link is in the description and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. It's probably a good idea to just make it absolutely clear. Fascism is a far-right ideology focused around marrying authoritarianism and ultranationalism. It's very common to call people fascist when they're being authoritarian now, but it isn't quite the same, and it is important we recognise fascists when we see them. Fascism is one of the most agile political theories out there. It is incredibly good at morphing, even disavowing entire parts of its theoretical legacy so that it can continue to survive and flourish in the dark corners of society. Fascists do this by stealing from any other political philosophy they can in order to gain popular support and bending what could be good policies towards darker motivations. We all know what the end result of fascism is. It's a supranationalistic state focused around traditional values, exercising the decadence of the elite, while simultaneously being elitist, and a harsh militarism that marries all aspects of life towards one goal, the glory of the state through the lens of the mythical leader. That's the end result. That's what it looks like in its final form. But why is it so addictive? Why does it get to that point? Why do people follow fascists even when they now know what fascism leads to? To understand this, we have to understand what fascism seeks to do. It isn't simple social conservatism. It isn't simple authoritarianism. Fascism requires a buy-in that most other political philosophies don't usually ask for. Conservatism doesn't usually ask you to put your faith in someone. It asks you to look at the world and see how its philosophy reflects truth. Liberalism, socialism, even communism all ask the same. Fascism, however, doesn't. Fascism tells you to not pay attention to the world, but to the leader, because the leader will change the world. It is a seductive ideology that appeals to the powerless and the poor, and the disadvantaged, especially if, within their lifetime, they remember a time when things were better for them and their social group. Often, there hasn't been any actual disadvantaging, but merely the loss of privilege. If, for example, your competition for jobs is just other white people, it is far easier to get a job than if you also have to compete on even footing against all the minorities too. This loss of privilege can feel like oppression. Let us take a look at how fascism takes hold. As the world has globalized, and as the machinery of industrialization and post-industrialization become more diffused, more mass-produced, there has been a loss of identity, a loss of purpose, almost a loss of self. As the old structures of society are washed away, so too are the signifiers of social meaning. If in your village you were the man because you could, say, cut down 15 more trees than the next person, if your village industrializes and rapidly becomes a town and then a city, now machines do the tree cutting. You've lost your social status. To that person, they've lost everything and are now just another cog in the machine. Often, those they look down on, those of lower status or from different ethnic groups, are set aside to them to work the same job and even promoted above them. This is bewildering, enraging and soul-destroying. This person is now a prime target for a fascist. Now imagine this replicated across an entire country, in every village, town and city. Masses of lives, devoid of meaning, pushed towards a brutal industrial machine focused on extracting as much profit as possible. then had discontent over the state of the nation. In Germany, the humiliation of Versailles, or perhaps another perceived loss, such as the dismemberment of an empire. And if that isn't enough, add the absolute chaos of an economic disaster, be it the Great Depression or the Great Recession. Into this heady, volatile mix now enter a leader, usually a man, who talks about this time of decadence where gilded elitists who stand for nothing collaborate with the enemy and are taking advantage of the nation being brought low. It's about standing up for our values, for our rights against them. It's about bringing back dignity, about giving you meaning again, and it's about that time when things were good and times were prosperous and the nation was strong, that the nation needs to be strong again, and all you need to do is trust in his vision, trust in his demands, believe in him, and he will bring it all back. He will restore everything. He will change the very world itself for you, for the nation. If he's a liar, it doesn't matter. If he's a fraud, it doesn't matter. Because it's about the vision. It's about restoring the nation. It's about getting your life back because, it was taken from you by those that you know as the enemy. A face and a name has been given to the loss of your life, and you're going to get your vengeance. You're going to get your pound of flesh, and you're going to get everything back. And we're going to soar to even greater heights because he told us. He told us so. He promised us. This is the double-edged sword of fascism. It's designed to make you keenly feel the loss of what has gone and then enrage you by dangling it in front of you, telling you that you can have it again if you just give in and trust the leader that it is them that is the cause of your ills. It doesn't matter who or what them is, it's just enough that there is a them. In Nazi Germany, it was the Jews, especially Jewish Marxists and the Roma. In Italy, it was the communists and the lesser races, like Slavs and so on. All you need is a group that you can define as the enemy, and that becomes the people of it. Every communist, every liberal, everyone who shares the seed of that thought or the blood of those people is an enemy, one of them, and they are a threat to you, your life, and to the nation. That's how you dehumanize people, to the point where genocide becomes not only an option, but the logical next step. It is highly telling that the high point of fascism was in the aftermath of the horrific First World War and the lived reality of the Great Depression with no end in sight. It's also telling that fascism is making a resurgence after the War on Terror and the aftermath of the Great Recession, which just seems to stretch on and on and on. History may not repeat itself, but it will echo, as those who failed before will learn. It goes back to that point about fascists being agile. They know that you can't openly call for genocide, so they instead call for a homeland for whites. They don't openly call for an authoritarian state. They say the state can't deal with the attacks brought by liberals and leftists. They don't openly shout about their aims. They couch their language and pretend it's all jokes. It's systemic, organised, political gaslighting. They also rely heavily on symbols, on propaganda, and on uniform. In some ways, you can describe fascism as a political ideology masquerading as a self-help program, because so much of what fascists do is designed to create that sense of primal terror and then make you feel powerful by appearing to step out from that terror. They give you uniforms to wear, a symbol full of history, and an in-group of people like you who have the same problems and want to fix things, want to be better. And that community, that sense of unity, that sense of purpose is deeply, deeply attractive to people, especially those who feel lost and adrift in a world they no longer recognise. And it shows. It shows in the areas that fascists go to recruit. I know in the United Kingdom, on the left, a lot of people like to laugh about the gammon, but these are all former industrial communities cut adrift by Thatcher and never given aid or helped after steadily. What built them is eroded away. This is the same in the United States, in former industrial communities in Pennsylvania or Ohio or Michigan. As the economy has changed, so too has those formerly proud communities. They viewed themselves as strong, independent communities who didn't ask for help and didn't need it. They built their lives with their own labour. They worked hard for everything they had. Their communities were prosperous, proud and strong, and now they have nothing left except the memory of that pride. The modern Democratic Party has no answer for these problems, because to address these problems is to challenge the very basis of our economic system. This is the inherent problem with wedding liberalism to capitalism, that eventually globalized efficiency means that the contrasting dichotomy of liberalism falls out of balance. You cannot have a mass manufacturing base and preserve the rights of the working classes. It is simply illogical for the owner or CEO of a business focused on manufacture, where the skills required can be taught to another worker halfway around the world for a fraction of a cost, with lower regulations and lower standards. In the pure cost-benefit analysis of those focused just on profit, unless you can secure a subsidy or grant from the government, there is absolutely no incentive to keep that job in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Bradford, in Rotherham, in Sheffield or Wolverhampton. Despite the growing prosperity of our times, these places not only decay and disrepair. It is telling that all of those places voted for Trump or Brexit. They are feeling dislocated in a world where that which once gave them pride has been stripped away from them, and the modern fascists have stepped in to promise them that with their support they can take it all back. They can take back control. Where the liberals and third-way progressives have fallen down is that they don't understand what the problem is. People in these areas don't want crappy retail jobs that barely pay the bills. They want to be like their parents and grandparents who fed a family on their sole job at the factory. They want the dignity of hard work, and they want the pride of their communities brought back. Both of those votes were shots across the bows. The fascists are on the move. A fascist state seeks to wed private enterprise to the glory of the nation. It is not about the traditional conservative thought of freer the market, freer the individual, or the same as the socialist view that the economy must work for the people. It is the idea that the economy should work for the state, because people should put the state ahead of themselves. Whereas socialists trade on the idea of dignity for all, particularly internationalist socialists, fascists trade on the idea of all being equal towards working for the glory of the nation. Can you see how such a small change makes such a huge difference? It's why fascists are so comfortable in appropriating socialist policies and subverting them to their end, because they don't see the part about dignity for the worker, and instead view these policies as a means to get dignity and glory for the state. Fascists often point to Germany in the 1930s as an example of why their state works, that the economic growth seen by Germany at that point was hailed as a miracle and lifted it out of the Great Depression. Three Arrows did a really good breakdown of Nazi Germany's economy, and I'll link that in the description. But the salient point for us here is that fascist economies are authoritarianism married to capitalism. It goes back to what I said about capitalism trending towards inequality. It functions perfectly fine with slave labour or an oligarchic system, or really anything, because profit is adaptable. The source of the money doesn't matter as long as it's money coming in. Fascists pick a few companies, large companies, as their economic backers, and then funnel their economic activity through them. It's a sort of nationalising and then leasing out to private enterprise. Both then profit, and the economy nominally gets low-cost goods, the caveat being that it's fueled by debt and slavery. So why do people, despite knowing where fascism leads, fall for it? It's because of that chameleon-like nature of fascism. Like I said earlier, it's very, very easy for a fascist to simply disavow part of their own ideology or to use code words or dog whistles or carefully worded statements to get around difficult problems. You'll hear them get asked questions such as, "Do you think the Holocaust was wrong?" And you'll get answers like, "I think all violence is wrong. It was a tragedy." It's deliberately vague to couch their beliefs and allow their supporters in the know, so to speak, to show to other people that they're not fascists because they condemned violence and think the Holocaust was wrong. But wink wink, everyone in the know really knows what's being said. They're very, very good at public relations and understanding a part of the human psyche that depends upon adversity, that relies upon that anger and craves the respect and admiration of being strong. These concepts are millennia worth of social conditioning, which is what feminists and all progressive movements run into. It's the ideal of strength, the virtue of masculinity. The fascists exploit that virtue, that belief, the idea of self-reliance, and with carefully crafted statements, they pull you in, slowly but surely inoculating you to their beliefs that you'd reject at the start, but later would accept. Like an onion and an ogre, they have layers upon layers. On the first layer, it's just about harnessing that anger and getting you to focus on accepting those statements about providing dignity and bringing back the economic prosperity to those that built the nation, the often white working classes. Just remember that this is the perception, not the reality. From then on, it's a descending ladder where they act almost as the Virgil to your Dante and curate you through the levels until you accept the base premise that all of them must go by any and all means necessary. Them could be the Jew, the Muslim, the brown person, the black person, the foreigner, the Roma, the trade unionist, the liberal. It doesn't matter, just them. And when you're in with the crowd, when you've finally gotten on board with every idea, you go out and try to replicate the process over and over and over, never seeing, never being awake to the fact that what you would have reacted violently against only a few months ago, you now preach as if it is revelation from the divine. That is fascism. That is how it gets to people and pulls them. There's no right answers here. There's no easy way out of this. What worked against fascism in the past doesn't always work in the future. For example, one of the reasons fascism didn't take hold in the United Kingdom is because the UK banned the wearing of uniforms, denying the fascists of the time one of their most potent selling points to get people interested. Another key plank was no platforming. I'm sure you'll be shocked to hear that because from the sounds of media commentators across the spectrum, which has united people like Bill Maher and Tucker Carlson, is their derision for no platforming. And yet, Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists, cited continued disruption by Jewish activists, anarchists, communists and anti-fascists as one of the reasons he found it so hard to get traction publicly. Yeah, they're who you now call Antifa. Let me be clear. Let me be absolutely clear. Fascism is never a good idea. Usually I try to present the good sides and the bad sides of an ideology, even when I profoundly disagree with, such as capitalism. With fascism, there are no good sides. There is nothing of this that can be successful because the associated costs are so horrific that no matter what ethical calculation you use, it can never, ever be justified. Othering a group in society is already incredibly shady, but dehumanizing them to the point that genocide becomes not only an option, but the logical end point is frankly unconscionable. No ideology which has as its logical end goal the systematic destruction of an entire group of people can ever be justified or acceptable. When these neo-fascists, white nationalists or identitarians or alt-right or whatever they're calling themselves now say things like, "We believe in an ethno-state," they are at the very least advocating for a racial hierarchy, apartheid, followed by ethnic cleansing. There is no way that this is ever compatible with our conception of what a society, a free and fair society, should look like. So pay attention to what they're saying, be aware of the lures that they use, and use the resources available from centres such as the Southern Poverty Law Centre, and always remember, if someone walks, talks and quacks like a fascist, they usually are a fascist. To close this week, I would say this. The Holocaust was one of the worst crimes in human history, but it wasn't an accident. There is this mythology that is being created around it, where one devil misled the people, but that isn't the case. Hitler and the Nazis were ordinary people. As Hannah Arendt famously said, she was struck by the sheer banality of Eichmann. All attempts to psychoanalyze leading Nazis at Nuremberg showed them to be completely normal people who had just perpetrated one of the worst crimes in history. This idea that it can't happen here is popular. To blame Germans for somehow being deficient because it happened there is simply not acceptable. It can happen anywhere. Fascism can take hold anywhere. Nobody is immune. And if in our arrogance we believe that fascism will never take root in our home, we will one day wake up to the march of jackboots and wonder, how did it come to this? There are many on the right who like to criticise those on the left for being aware of fascism, and many centrists who try to think that fascism can be reasoned with, and that because we're not at the Hitler stage yet, we don't need to worry. But this is how fascists get to that point. They lie, they hide, and they slither until they're in a position where they don't need to hide, don't need to lie, and don't need to slither. But by that point, it's already too late, and Pastor Niemöller's poem is happening all over again. On that grim thought, thank you for listening. I understand it's not easy to talk about fascism, but it's something we have to constantly guard against. It's a long, thankless, and eternal conversation, so to everyone who's reached the end, thank you. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you next week for a shorter discussion about distinguishing between fascism and Nazism. Thank you again, and goodbye.